We look at the ratio today at 227 times what the average worker makes. It wasn't always that high. In the 1990s, we were at about 100 times what the average worker makes. In the 1970s, CEOs made about 20 times what the average worker makes. And so this ratio is certainly on a trajectory of increasing gains for the very, very top, with much more modest gains for average workers.
Now, there's not a lot that us in the rank and file can do about that disparity, but we have seen in recent years shareholders questioning executive pay. But when it comes down to a vote at the annual general meeting, they're always non-binding votes. So I guess the point I'm trying to get to is it's not a lot the worker can do, even the shareholder can do to sort of start to address this disparity.
Yeah, it certainly can be discouraging if if shareholders are interested in action on this. We did actually compare executive payrolls, so CEO, CFO, the top five wealthiest people running these companies, the C-suite, to indicators for company performance. And I mean, there's some interesting comparisons there. Of the companies that lost money on the TSX Composite, a third of them lost money because executive payroll was so high. Of the companies that made money, 13% of them paid more to their top five execs than they paid in corporate income taxes. So these payrolls aren't just abstract from shareholder perspective, they can actually have tangible impacts on performance. When it comes to how we would constrain this type of pay, certainly workers and even shareholders often don't have a lot of power in this area. However, public policy plays a role here. So we actually subsidize certain types of CEO pay, particularly stock options, where they pay half the tax rate that you'd make if you were just working. It does look like in 2020 the stock option deduction will finally be capped. There was a promise in last year's budget that likely will come through in this year's budget. And it looks like the federal government is targeting another $1.5 billion a year in closure of tax loopholes. And those are the types of most of that would be paid by top executives and top CEOs because they're the ones that benefit from these tax loopholes primarily.
Yeah, because that's what we'll often see when we break down a top CEO's compensation. The salary portion itself is usually, around $1 million or a little more. I wouldn't say no to that, but it's considered modest in comparison to maybe the 10 or 11 or the 12 million they bought home. So much of it beyond that is the stock option. It's other sort of enticements. So you're definitely saying there is a way this can be addressed by the government.
That's quite right. The salary portion is not really what's driving up this gap between CEOs and average workers. It's what's called variable pay. That means being paid in stock options, being paid directly in stock, or being paid in some form of bonus that's related to the stock price. And it's really those three pieces that have been gaining traction over the past decade that we've been tracking it, now hitting 79% of a CEO's pay on average comes from this variable pay package. And there are tax incentives for being paid that way. It's stock option deduction gets a 50% off coupon. Being paid in stock, as you see capital gains in those stock, that also gets a 50% off coupon. And so in essence, tax policy is subsidizing this type of outrageous pay. It does look like that's hopefully going to close in 2020, although we will have to wait to see in the February or March federal budget. That's really where the rubber will hit the road.
Now, David, we are told by people who defend this kind of pay that it is a very small pool of talent that can lead these big companies. And if we do not compensate them accordingly, they will simply go to greener pastures. Does that have any resonance with you?
Well, we actually looked at that in this year's report. We looked at how many of these CEOs were headhunted into the CEO position versus being, some young manager who worked their way up the company and became the CEO. It turns out that 75% of these richest CEOs, in fact, were not headhunted into the CEO position. They are lifers, in essence, at these companies. They were hired lower down, and they got promoted up through the ranks to the CEO desk. And so what that means is that this idea that there's a musical chairs of CEOs, and every time someone offers $1 more, all the CEOs shift chairs, just isn't true. These people have come up through the companies. On average, they've spent 18 years at the company that they CEO. And so there's always the threat, and the rich will threaten they're going to move or move to a different company. But when push comes to shove, they don't move. They're promoted up through the ranks. That's how you get to the CEO desk in Canada.